and I have decided to slip in another extra. Since our Scottish Rite history is to begin in the 1930s, and as I look around this room, there are not many who lived during that period. So I thought that a detailed look at the Great Depression first would give us a better background for understanding the Scottish Rite history when we do cover this interesting but tragic historical period. So let's get started. First with the nationwide picture of the Great Depression. Black Thursday, October the 24th, 1929, signaled the beginning of probably the worst economic period in the modern world, and definitely the worst in the United States. The Dow Jones average fell that day, that one day, from 380 to 230s, which was approximately 40% in one day. Panic set in, and the tumbling blocks of economic measurement began their domino effect. By 1932, the Dow was down, listen to this, the Dow was down to 45. In other words, almost a 90% drop from its pre-depression high. 90% drop. Can you all imagine what would happen today if we had a 90% drop in the Dow Jones average? The domino effect, simplified, works just like this. Most of you understand this. The stock market collapse made buyers defer normal purchases. When the demand waned, manufacturers cut back and laid off workers, who in turn could not pay their bills, much less purchase new products. This all led to more layoffs and unsold goods. When this downward spiral lasts for a year or two, it's called a recession. When it lasts for almost 10 years, it created what we now call the Great Depression. Most people think of this as a national problem, but in the 1930s, it actually became a worldwide problem. Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party had won the 1928 election, and when confronted with this problem, the Depression, they handled it as had been done in all previous recessions, which was almost nothing. They assumed that this was just another market correction like occurred in most recently in the 1920-21 period, and it would correct itself in a couple of years. Of course it did not. This time it just got worse. By 1932, when re-election rolled around, Hoover and the Republican Party were soundly defeated. Franklin Delano Roosevelt rode in on the scene with his white horse and his New Deal. 4 years later, at re-election time in 1936, Roosevelt had helped enough people to help the plight and to help the plight of the common man enough to get re-elected for another 4 years. The WPA and the CCC camps were a help in allowing people to feed their families, but really did not attack the base economic problems. Prior to this time, the U.S. government had never really created any kind of a security net for social issues. When I say social issues, I mean direct people help. They had helped in the past with governmental help, federal help to states and sometimes even to counties. But as far as direct help, like we now have food stamps and unemployment payments and that sort of thing, they had never done that. So examples of the Chicago fire and the San Francisco earthquake and other major natural disasters, the people had received very little direct government help. This is no time to discuss politics or how some of these Depression-era handouts have continued through the years. But this is a Masonic gathering, so let me say that the Scottish Rite at the Supreme Council level suffered some from reduced income, but had saved and invested their money in good order during the membership explosion years so that they were not in a vulnerable position. This is interesting. Grand Commander Coles had decided back in the 1920s that he was tired of reading negative articles in the New Age magazine, and he mandated that only positive articles, particularly about masonry, were to be printed. Thus, if you read the New Age magazine of the 1930s, you don't see much about the struggles that were taking place in the lodges and the valleys during these Depression years. Let me give you a few statistics which will give you a word picture of what was going on during these rough years. In 1930, the first full year of the Depression, 800 banks closed across the country. The next year, in 1931, 2,300 banks closed. Today we are experiencing an 8 to 10% unemployment and are screaming for help in the form of unemployment checks and food stamps and so forth. By 1932, unemployment had skyrocketed to 30%. Almost one of every 3 people who had a job, pre-Depression job, were now out of a job. Even in 1940, when the Depression was officially over, Oklahoma still had an unemployment rate of 14%. By 1933, 40% of all mortgaged residences in the United States had experienced foreclosure. Folks, that's 2 out of every 5 financed homes in the country during 1933 had by that time experienced foreclosure. During this decade, another interesting fact, during this decade, 1,300 local governmental units, which means cities and counties, went bankrupt. But here's the real clinker. 3 states in these United States went into bankruptcy. They were Arkansas, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Oklahoma and many other states were really close to this same fate. These figures are staggering, but give you an idea of how bad conditions were on the national scene during these Depression years. Now, if these figures sound bad, things were even worse in Oklahoma. So let's now focus our attention on those years in our state. Actually, this is the reason for this talk, and that is to give you a perspective of what our forefathers endured so that you can relate it to the Masonic fraternity next month when we cover this time period of the Scottish Rite history. The nation dates the beginning of the Depression with the stock market crash in 1929, as mentioned. However, Oklahoma was already in a major recession in the latter part of the Roaring '20s. In those days, Oklahoma's economic structure was supported by 2 basic industries. Really not too much different than it is today. But at that time, we only had 2 major industries, oil and agriculture. We'll now take a look at each one of these 2 industries. First, with the oil. Oklahoma's oil business started in the Bartlesville area, Osage Nation, in 1898, and then as wildcatting and drilling began, it spread over much of the state in a wild and crazy manner. Fields were discovered in the Tulsa, Glenpool area, then Ponca City, Oklahoma City, Enid, Ardmore, Seminole, Wewoka, and Ada. There were very few conservation regulations in place during those days, and the ones that were seemed to be ignored. So, for example, if a successful well was drilled someplace, then 100 derricks would then be built in the close proximity of that producer. This created an overabundance of oil for the nationwide demand, as there were not nearly as many automobiles in use then, and also the other uses for crude oil that we have today were not so numerous. This oversupply and under demand dropped the price of crude to less than $1 a barrel. This frenzy of uncontrolled production was not limited to our state. Thereafter, across the Red River, even larger fields were opened in East Texas and then westward in the Permian Basin area around Midland and Odessa. Also, California oil was coming into the market, so the crude market was just plain flooded. Consequently, the market continued to drop to 50 cents a barrel, then 25 cents a barrel, then, if you can believe it, 10 cents a barrel. Now, if you can compare that with recent petroleum prices that we have now, which range around $100 a barrel, you can see what a difference. Now back to the 10-cent pricing. The problem continued to worsen. As long as other companies were pumping oil as fast as they could, all competitors thought they had to do the same. So three things basically happened. Prices continued to fall, entire fields began to play out, and oil companies were going bankrupt. So this was the state of affairs of the oil industry during the pre-Depression years of the 1920s. So when the nation plunged into the Depression in 1929, the Oklahoma oil industry had already been there for several years. Let's turn our attention now to agriculture. We see an even more depressing picture because there are more people involved. Just as uncontrolled production of oil saturated the market, the same thing happened to farm commodities. Every year of the 1920s, Oklahomans raised more cattle. Every year the price of beef fell. Every year they grew more cotton, and every year prices dropped. Every year they harvested more corn and wheat, and every year grain prices tumbled. This overproduction was primarily due to the following reasons. First, the improvement in farm implement technology. The tractor replaced the mule, improved combines, planters, hay balers, and so forth. This created more land under cultivation. The second major reason was that during this time, 1920s, they basically had good weather conditions, which made for good crop growing. And then third, there was an all-out effort by the U.S. government back in the years of 1916 to 1920 to produce the maximum amount of food that they could for the war effort. And unfortunately, this spilled over into the 1920s and added to this overproduction. Every year, farmers either took out new mortgages or fell deeper in debt. This condition was nationwide, but what made Oklahoman plight worse was the prevalence of sharecropping, particularly in eastern Oklahoma. Sharecropping meant that the landowner and the operator farmer split the income. When the income was small, the sharecroppers suffered twice as much as the farmers in other parts of the country who actually owned their own land. A proper question would be, why did Oklahoma have more sharecroppers than in most of the other parts of the country? Well, when people homesteaded all over the West, the United States government gave them 160 acres as long as they abided by a 5-year agreement of making improvements to the land and actually living on the acreage for a certain length of time each year. Therefore, most of the farmers around over the country owned their own land. In Indian Territory, before statehood could occur, the tribal ownership of land had to be parceled out to each member of the tribe. Unfortunately, the Indians were not ready for the white man's world, and by 1920, most of this allotted land was in the hands of a bank, unscrupulous businessmen, or had been lost because of non-payment of taxes. So let me say that again. Unfortunately, the Indians were not ready for the white man's world, and by 1920, most of this allotted land that they had been given was not in their hands anymore. Thus the landowners were not hands-on farmers and had to seek other people to do their work. So I can call your attention to the map, this one map that gives you the idea of where the tenant farming or sharecropping was the most prevalent. So when 1930 arrived and the rest of the country was singing the blues about bad economic times, many Oklahomans had already been there for a couple of years. Therefore, the new economic crisis only compounded their plight. If these economic problems were not enough, another terrible condition occurred, particularly in the southern plains states, in the form of a horrible heat wave, accompanied by a dastardly drought. The heat drought condition didn't just last for one growing season, or even 2 or 3. It lasted for 9 consecutive years. Can you imagine having 9 straight years of weather like we experienced last summer, especially considering that no one had air conditioning? Irrigation farming, of course, was almost non-existent, so each crop failure was followed one by another. 1936 still holds most of the hot, dry weather records. Temperatures during that 1936 period actually hit 120 in our state. This year, 1936, was my first year to attend school. In other words, I went to the first grade in 1936, so I personally remember these uncomfortable times. The Oklahoma farmers seemed to be snake bit. Good weather in the 20s created overproduction and bad weather, and overproduction and bad weather in the 30s created almost no production. This, of course, brought on extreme frustration. While wrestling with these conditions, yet another dilemma had to be dealt with. As mentioned previously, almost every inch of farmable land was placed under cultivation during these years. In addition to the above, there was land in the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas which was still government owned, as it had not been homesteaded by anybody. Nobody wanted it, basically. They didn't think they could make a living out of it. So the government came up with a plan. Instead of homesteaders being given the customary 160 acres, they added an enticement of 320 acres to settle these areas. This just added to the amount of land under cultivation and the plowing under of the natural grasses of the area. Add to the above the intense heat, no rain, and constant high winds, and you have the formula for the last problem: dust storms. An area covering parts of 6 states was given the undesirable title of Dust Bowl, and of course I refer you to the map. Now I thought the Dust Bowl was just a general term that covered most all of the central part of the United States, including our area here in McAlester, because I know we had a lot of dust storms. But we didn't have storms. The maximum area of the dust storms was covered right there by the map that you see. And let me tell you, let me deal a little bit into that to explain why that was the dust storm area. In 1932, this area that is marked off there produced 14 storms. And those storms that reduced visibility to less than 1 mile. These storms were called rollers. Now, this was the measurement that was used to describe a bona fide dust storm. If the storms were if the visibility was less than 1 mile, then it was called a bona fide dust storm. There were a lot of other days when all of this area and a lot of other areas to the east actually had dusty days, but they didn't qualify as a storm. So let's go back So there were 14 storms in 1932 that fell under this qualification. In the years 1933 to 1938, there were 301 storms of this magnitude. Now, these storms weren't one-day storms either. Many of these storms lasted 2 or 3 days at a time. The wind would drive the dust particles so hard that few coated or painted surfaces survived in the Dust Bowl area. This sandblasting not only removed paint, but also would eat into the wood surfaces itself. Farmers had no hay, and very few crops survived, so to feed their animals, they would capture tumbleweeds and yucca limbs and grind it up for food for the animals. Dirt would pile up on the homes and barns, sometimes covering windows, sometimes covering sometimes blowing over or covering up fences. If the farmers' cattle survived, the only winter fuel many folks had were the cow chips. Now, keep in mind that electric co-ops had not reached many of these folks at this time. The Dust Bowl was where the intents or the rollers were located. However, the geographic areas to the east of the Dust Bowl also had many dust storms. Occasionally, dust accumulations were felt as far to the east as the East Coast. As the previous decade was labeled the Roaring Twenties, many called these years the Dirty 30s. Now, 80 years later, we wonder why anyone would stay and endure these conditions. To sustain life, there has to be hope. After 9 consecutive years of horrible economic and weather conditions, for many, there just was no hope. I'm sure many of the folks felt like Job in the Old Testament. Charles Dickens wrote in his book, The Tale of Two Cities, these were the best of times and the worst of times. And to the Depression-era Oklahoma farmers, these had to be the worst of times. So many left, leaving their dreams, their homes, and taking only what they could cram into and on top of their beat-up cars. People not only from Oklahoma, but people from all over the lands of the central part of the country left. Many actually were driven off their foreclosed places. Most headed west to California. Now, California was suffering from the same economic depression, but not the severe weather conditions. Regardless of what state they came from, most Californians called these immigrants Okies. And there were more of these displaced people from Oklahoma than any other state, so the term probably was not that inaccurate. Between 1930 and 1940 census, Oklahoma lost 60,000 people. The percentage lost by counties was as follows. Of our state's 77 counties, 14 of them lost between 1% and 15% of their pre-depression population. 26 counties lost between 16% and 29%. And then 23 counties lost between 30% and 48% of their people. Now, there was 14 counties that actually gained in population due to people moving from the rural areas to the cities. So in other words, the counties like the Oklahoma City County and Tulsa and Lawton and some of those, they actually gained in population because the rural people were moving to the cities. Now, Pittsburgh County fell into the highest loss group with a loss of 32% of their population. 32% of their population, which is basically 1/3 of the people. I've got more information on these things, but I don't have time to get into it. But basically, notwithstanding the dust storms, more people left eastern Oklahoma than western Oklahoma because we had more numbers to start with, and tenant farming was the norm. So in closing, let me say this. When writing about the Great Depression, most journalists use images and unemployed men selling apples on the big city street corners, boarded up factories, people in soup lines because of the big city. This was the big city industrialized area perspective. These images, as depressing as they are and were not as bad as the scenes of the uprooted Okies being forced off their land, with dirt and dust piled up against the shanty they called home and heading west in their old jalopies. Oklahomans, particularly the farmers, really suffered during the Great Depression. Next month, when we're talking about the Scottish Rite history during these years, remember how tough life was from our discussion tonight.